I grew up in a lake house in Alabama for a large portion of my life. It was right near a historical battlefield. So we live in this house, and me as a toddler, weird stuff starts happening. One night, my mom woke me up to find me not in the house anywhere. She and my brother, who's about 9 at this time, I'm around 3, begin frantically searching for me. They find me at 1 or 2 in the morning on our pier, about to step off into the water. I don't remember anything about this, but I told my mom I followed a baby ghost and a big ghost down to the pier, and her deceased grandfather was down there and told me not to go into the water or I'd get eaten by an alligator. Keep in mind, I'm 3 years old saying this. And events like this happened one other time. There was also a time our whole house filled with smoke. My mom got me and my brother out of there and called 911 from the neighbors. The fire department arrived, and despite them too seeing a massive amount of smoke in the home, no fire was ever found. Other random things would happen, like TVs turning off and the volume turning up, doors opening on their own, and just an overwhelming sense we were not ever alone in the house. One particular incident happened like this when my mom was hosting a home interior party. Also, while we lived in this home, my mom got very sick, almost died numerous times. It was constantly an issue of her having severe medical problems while we lived in that home. Once we moved out in 2000, she got much better. She recently passed away in 2020. The most infamous incident was quite disturbing. One morning, my mom wakes up and notices blood splattered all over the walls of our house. It was as if someone dipped their fingertips in blood and flicked it over every wall in the home. What's weird is there was none on the floor, except 3 drops on our living room floor. My mom also found a few drops in a pair of flats she had. She frantically searches everyone in the house and no one is injured at all. So she then begins cleaning, and it's not really ever spoken of again. Me and my family bought a grocery store in South Alabama and moved in 2000. We never had any experiences close to this ever again. Okay, so I'm 19 years old now, and this was back in 2010 when I was 8. And my granddad died. This occurrence was like 2 weeks after he passed on. So, my mum had lost her glasses. She needed them for reading and driving and so on. If not, she got terrible headaches. Now, for some reason, she thought I'd stolen them and thrown them away or hidden them. Maybe my face looked cheeky when she first asked me or something, because I can't think of why she'd assume it was me. But oh boy, she was persistent. I felt bad and wanted to prove my innocence, so I helped her look. For 3 whole days, we searched under cupboards, on desks, worktops, down sofas, and checked every room multiple times. My mum was mad at me. She treated me as if I'd done it, as if I'd come clean about it or something, telling me she was disappointed. I didn't think much of it because I knew I hadn't taken her glasses, but my pleas and my truth wasn't really listened to. So fast forward a day or 2 after us looking, my mum finally starting to calm down. My dad, mum and I were sat in the lounge and my dad was showing us some photo albums of my granddad. I remember it being fond. We were laughing, smiling, crying, and then pop. The next thing we heard and saw was the rolling of a bottle cap lid from one end of the kitchen to the other, until it stopped abruptly under the cupboard in the kitchen. I immediately went to investigate. I saw the already opened Ribena bottle was lidless. Here's a fact about the Ribena. It's not a carbonated drink, so the fact it popped off is so uncalled for, especially because it was already opened that night. My mum and dad followed in, and I stuck my hand under the cupboard where it went. Well, when I tell you the only reason that bottle stopped was because it ran into my mum's glasses, believe me, we had checked under there countless times. I'd say nothing short of 10. Yet the real stinger was the bottle lid had led us there. Because why would we check there again after things were dying down? After we knew their glasses were not there? I always think back to this as my granddad saying hi and also helping me out. I don't know where the glasses were originally lost, but it wasn't there. My mum and dad were amazed, and all three of us to this day can't explain it. Alright, so let me preface this real fast by saying that I do firmly believe there is life out there, somewhere in the universe. Whether or not it's intelligence is another question, and I'm skeptical of the stereotypical alien. On the other hand, I saw something in the sky tonight for the second time that I can't explain, and it's honestly freaking me out a little. I used to deliver newspapers, which was primarily working early hours of the morning, 2 a.m. to 8 a.m. at the latest. So it was dark as I was delivering. I've always been a bit of a stargazer, so I'd look at the sky while delivering papers. A few months into my job, I'm looking at the sky as I'm walking to someone's door and see a couple of red lights. I think it was 3 lights if I remember correctly. At first, I thought it was a plane, but it appeared to be completely still. I didn't think anything of it, but when it actually started to move, that's when I started to get a bit creeped out. It was almost as if the lights moved back just a little, and then forward again and suddenly shot into the distance. When I say it shot into the distance, I mean in an instant, it had completely disappeared. I saw this all with my own eyes. It was a clear night, not a single cloud in the sky, and it was just gone in a split second. I have no way of describing it other than how it looks in the movies. It genuinely looked like it warped into hyperspeed or something, or went through some kind of void. I know how crazy it sounds, but I know what I saw. I never mentioned it to anyone else because I thought they would look at me like I was crazy. I had no way of explaining what it was, so there was no point in ever mentioning it. It could have possibly been explained away by something rational, who knows? I never saw any news of it mentioned. That was around January or February, I believe. Now, I think I saw it again tonight. I was watching TV with my mom. There's a giant window behind the couch. I was sitting on in the living room. It's also a pretty clear night with few clouds. We were joking around when she starts to stare at something behind me. I asked her what she was looking at, and she tells me to look at the lights in the sky behind me. I look, and I see a few red lights. They look like the same lights I saw delivering papers. She tells me that the light was white at first and coming towards us, and then when she saw it, it was almost as if they noticed and suddenly turned around. One white light turned into the 3 red lights that I was now seeing. We both go by the window and look at this, and it starts to move. It turns around and turns back into that white light. But here's the weird part. This was no plane and no helicopter. Whatever this was not moving in a straight line. As my mom and I were watching these lights in the sky, it dashes in a circular sort of motion. It's hard to describe, but it was almost as if it went around in an oval sort of motion and then zipped into the distance the same way. It also completely disappeared in an instant. Bear in mind, when we saw this moving, it went fast. I have never in my life seen something move in the sky like this had, and never in my life have I seen something in the sky move as quickly as this did. I honestly don't have the words. It's so difficult to describe exactly what I saw, and I'm sorry to say I didn't get it on video. My mom and I both went outside to try and find it, but couldn't. I'm just kind of freaked out by it all. What do you guys think? Am I just insane? I don't know what I saw. Maybe there is a rational explanation for it. Still, it leaves me wondering. It doesn't sit well with me that this is the second time I've seen something like this in such a small time span. I have been raised in an extremely abuseful and neglectful environment. As a child, from the ages of about 7 to 11, I was frequently sexually abused by my father's employee. I don't have many memories of my childhood, but I remember this period was extremely dark for me. I was suicidal, even at that age. It was during this period of time that I started seeing this entity. I would see it from the corner of my eye. It never did anything, but I could feel it watching me. At night, I used to cover myself in blankets and block out all light, so I got a sense of if I can't see it, then it can't see me either, right? After the sexual abuse stopped, I stopped seeing it too for a period of time. I never thought about it either. It was as if my brain consciously suppressed those memories. I remembered the sexual abuse, but I didn't remember seeing this thing whenever I thought of my childhood. It started again when I was 16. I had my class 10th board exams and I was under immense stress and anguish. I started seeing it again. I would be studying, nose in my textbook, and I would feel the overwhelming sensation of being watched. I never heard anything. It was just the feeling and vaguely seeing something from the corner of my eyes. I'm 18 now. I've just been forced to leave my house due to the situation back there. My mental health is in shambles once again. I'm living with my cousin now, and I've started to get that feeling again. I constantly feel watched, and the feeling only continues to escalate as the days pass. The entity itself appears vaguely non-threatening, just a pale, elongated face that always appears to be peeking from the corner. I've never had the chance to look at it directly because every time I turn my head in its direction, it hides by ducking behind the door. It also always seems to be in a crouching position. I just hope this is only my half-beaten brain playing tricks on me, because I don't have the energy to deal with this thing. This was a few years back, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was in the back of the car and my whole family was in it as well. We parked the car outside a bakery so that my parents could go inside and get some bread. I was looking outside the window towards the sky because I was really bored, and I noticed some weird shapes that were positioned right on top of the part of the city we were at. Now, I know clouds can take all sorts of forms and that it's completely normal. However, there were two faces up in the sky, and they were made of clouds but super detailed, down to the very last hair on their head. One of them looked like what I supposed Zeus is portrayed like in every movie ever. Beard, longish hair, bushy eyebrows. The other one was of an old woman. Her hair was in a bun and her face was wrinkly. Like I said, the amount of detail on their faces was otherworldly. So far, you could say all of it could have just been clouds formed randomly in the sky. And that's what I would have thought too. If their eyes weren't completely black, their eyes were just a deep black, and it seemed like they were both looking down towards the city, kind of like they were looking down at humans. I looked at them for a few minutes in awe, and then turned to my left to tell my sister, but as soon as I looked back, they were gone. I remember I wasn't afraid of them, just curious of what they could be. Has anyone ever experienced something similar, or could have an explanation for it? I've always wondered what they might be. I've buried a lot of stuff for years and very rarely ever talked about it. I always thought it made me sound crazy or disingenuous. But after learning that the Hat Man is actually very real, maybe I'm not crazy. I think it would be helpful to others if I share some of my experiences. I will start with Juanita. Juanita was a resident of the long-term care facility I worked at in 2009. She was an absolute gem of a woman, one of the nicest residents I have ever had the pleasure of caring for. She was wheelchair-bound for most part and wore matching clothes sets and white sneakers to walk herself around in. She had white short hair that was done in the typical old lady style, and she was very kind. I left the facility in the middle of the year for maternity leave. When I left, she was just fine. I didn't go back for a visit until my daughter was about a month or two old. I decided to stay home with my newborn for a while instead of going back to work, but my stepmom still worked there. Because of the flight risk, It was a lockdown facility and a code was needed to get in and out. I buzzed myself in and started down the long hall towards the back of the building. You have to pass the kitchen door in the dining room on your way to what is called the South Hall. As I was coming up to the kitchen, which was closed and locked up, I could see Juanita sitting in her chair, in her pajamas, banging on the door with her big pink cup. She was asking for ice. I walked up to her and said hi. I told her the kitchen was closed and to go back to her room and wait for the snack cart to come around. The snack cart is a small kitchen cart loaded with snacks and ice for residents who can't sleep or get hungry at night. She smiled and said she would, and as I walked away, I looked back and saw her wheeling herself behind me. I don't know why I didn't push her back to her room myself, as it was literally on my way. Any other time, I would have done just that. Again, I don't know why I didn't. I just kept walking and went to the nurse's station where my stepmom was. As soon as I saw her, I told her that Juanita was banging on the kitchen door for ice and offered to take the snack cart down to her. She stared at me like I was crazy and said, "Who?" I told her again, "Juanita Willis." She rolled her eyes and laughed and said, "You must be losing it. Juanita is dead." I thought she was kidding. Immediately I turned around and went straight to Juanita's room. It was almost empty. Just a few things that left that family hadn't taken, and her wheelchair. I never went back after that. As I said, many things have happened over the years. This is just one that sticks out. I feel like we all know ghosts and the afterlife are real, and when we experience things like this, we feel so strongly about it. But just like dreams, a few minutes after we wake up, the feelings start to fade. 3 years ago, during my electrical apprenticeship, I was working for a contractor that mainly did state contract work. The biggest job I worked on for that contractor was an operational prison. We were remodeling some offices in the cell blocks, turning them into classrooms and clerical spaces. About halfway through the project, I was working in the tunnels under the cell blocks. If memory serves me, I was building a conduit run to power a panel in the cell block above. I was in a utility room with my back to the door working. I turned around to get something from my cart and noticed the door was closed. The doors in the tunnel were all thick, heavy steel doors that scraped the concrete when you open or close them. This particular door was warped and only opened about 2 feet. Funny thing is, I didn't hear the door move. In my mind, I'm thinking the guard that shadows us while we're inside was messing with me, so I opened the door with the expected screeching of metal on concrete. I looked around and I saw the guard about 100 yards back towards the entrance of the tunnel. This particular guard was a heavy-set older gentleman, very likable, very out of shape. So I walked down to where he was sitting, feet straight out with ankles crossed, snoring. I approached him and asked him if he was messing with me. He denied it, saying he was asleep the whole time. The man was not in any kind of shape to quietly close a dragging steel door, then sprint 100 yards without being winded and breathing heavily. So I believed him and went back to work. Back in my little workspace, I get wise and work with all my stuff inside, and I only had my back to the door for a limited time. A few minutes after I resumed what I was doing, I was standing by my cart facing the door, when the door slammed shut with enough force for me to feel wind. This time, the door screeched and slammed quite loud. It was loud enough that the guard came down to check it out. I was down in that same tunnel, working in a crawl space. I was hanging brackets to support conduit that we were going to use to feed a panel we were going to hang in the cell block above. There wasn't really anything that stands out above these crawl spaces. None of them felt really sinister or anything. They were raised up off the ground. Thankfully, when it rains, the tunnels tend to get a lot of water. They were concrete floored and about 3 feet tall. Tore at my knees crawling around in them. I had done work in a few of these crawl spaces before this one. I think it was cell block B. All the cell blocks were alphabetical. This particular crawl space had a light, but it didn't work. Hard hats headlamps were crucial in the tunnel. So I'm in this crawl space working. I only had 1 or 2 supports mounted. I'm hammer drilling holes for anchor points, and I get this sudden feeling of being watched. I turn around and look towards the opening, thinking the guard or my partner were looking in on my work, but no one was there. Back to work I go. I got the bracket mounted up and I get that feeling again. This time, I felt the gaze from a dark corner, far to the opposite side of the space. I never heard anyone come into the space, but I knew someone was in that corner. I turned my head to look in that direction, and my latter yelled from outside it's lunchtime. I kind of hauled it out of there, but as I stepped out onto the ladder to exit, I looked into that corner. The only thing that was there was what looked like an old rag. We did work in cell blocks from A to H, and I only felt that kind of direct attention in a crawl space twice. Both times, it was very similar, except in the second crawl space, there was nothing else visible in the space with me. The first experience I actually ever had down in the tunnels started off with a conversation. As I remember, that's me, my tool partner and 2 guards, had just entered the tunnel and the guards were explaining their procedures. How we were only supposed to have 2 of the doors down there open at once. How we can have the crash gate, a gate that splits the tunnel in half in case of riots. Another gate mirrors the tunnel gate in the cell blocks above. Unlocked, but it has to stay closed, and how 1 guard would have to remain in the tunnel until we left for the day. The whole time, the guards were speaking to us. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my left eye, like a pacing back and forth in front of a light. It was blocking the light, which I think is why I noticed it. I must have had a puzzled look on my face because my guard, we both had one assigned to us, personally because we would be split up often, 1 above and 1 in the tunnel, asked me if I had a question. Well, I guess I did, and I asked if anyone else noticed the person pacing at the end of the tunnel. The guard kind of looked at me funny. Not like he thought I was crazy, more like a knowing look. My tool partner did, however, call me crazy, and we went back on with the day with no other incidents. A few weeks later, but still before my first story, and really close to the same time as my second story, maybe days away from the crawl space incidents, we were a little further down the tunnel. I want to say that we were right by the gate because the photo I took was taken from beside the gate. We were having a bull session before we got to work. Once again, I was seeing the pacing man, but this time I didn't mention it. I watched the guard's eyes. I noticed he kept firing glances that direction. Then he suddenly and quickly turned his head towards it, which made me look as well. About halfway between us and where we saw the pacing man was a stack of boxes. There, leaning out from behind those boxes, we saw plain as Jew saw each other was a man in a brown prison uniform. We kind of looked at each other and the guard went into action. I grabbed a pipe bender and followed. I had to provide backup, not because of a rule, but because we were supposed to be alone down there. We walked down to find where we saw the figure and found nothing. This is when I noticed that where we saw the pacing man was a ramp that goes down to another gate, which I was told leads to the main road and is the entrance point for the utilities. The light was about 6 feet off the ground above the gate. I walked over for a closer inspection and noticed a 1/2-inch water line was pumping like someone was shaking it. I wrote that off as a mouse or a giant roach. I swear I saw one carrying a dead frog down there. This is when my guard told me of his own personal experiences, which are my next 2 stories. Everything else happened were either explainable or just feelings. Feelings of rage or sorrow. Things would be moved, but we figured the guards were having fun. I used to work night shift when I first started here in the prison. I always signed up for but never got the rover job. Rover is a guard that sits in the guard shack and makes rounds twice a shift to check every door and every gate to ensure they are locked, and checks the perimeter fences to make sure they have not been tampered with. One night, I finally got what I thought was going to be the easiest shift I ever had. I landed the Rover job. During that shift, my first trip around the perimeter and gates went just fine. Everything was as it should be. However, my second round was a little different. I was patrolling the tunnel access points, checking the gates and doors as I had done earlier that day. In the tunnel, there are 3 books that the Rover must sign to prove they made their appointed rounds. I had books A and B signed. I just had book C to go. Book C lay down a long and dark corridor. Picture a long hallway with one bare bulb lighting up a patch of the path every 20 or 30 feet. I entered the hallway and closed and locked the gate behind me. As I started to walk towards the bookend of the hall, I heard footsteps behind me. I hurried to the first patch of light and looked behind me. No one there. When I stopped, so did the accompanying footsteps, so I wrote it off as an echo. I continued on, and as soon as I exited the path of light, the footsteps returned, this time just a little faster, almost like it was trying to catch up. Once again, in the next patch of light, I stopped and looked for my pursuer. And again, I saw nothing and the steps stopped. I turned and looked towards book C. It's 2 more patches of light away. It actually was in a 3rd patch by itself, like a beacon of safety. I'm starting to get a little nervous about now, so I pull out my flashlight and shine it around. My light illuminates nothing but the damp walls of this part of the tunnel, so I keep on walking. As soon as I left that patch of light, I hear those steps again, only this time, it sounds like they are jogging towards me. I quickly spin around and shine my light towards the sound and once again see nothing. I decided now is not the time to mess around, so I ran to the last light and the book so I can get the hell out of this tunnel. As I reached the book, I could hear the steps sprinting towards me. I quickly signed my name in the book, and as I wrote down the time, I heard a heavy sigh behind me. And right in my ear, a husky voice whispered my name. I slowly turned my head towards the sigh. Seeing nothing, I sprinted out of there, stopping only long enough to lock the doors behind me. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I can still feel the breath of my ear when it whispered my name. I put in for a shift change right away, and I never signed up for Rover duty again. Myself, my spouse, my father-in-law, step-sibling and 2 good friends were in a shitty hotel just for the nights for Repticon. We checked in, my spouse and I and our 2 friends are in one room, with my father-in-law and step-sib in the other next one over. We got delivery and busted out some drinks around 8 p.m. We were all various states of drunk. None of us were beyond tipsy, but decided to stop drinking for the night and played Jackbox until we decided to sleep. At exactly midnight, sounds corny I know, the standard hotel radio clock starts channel surfing without any of us touching it. Clock was stuck at 12 and blinking even though it had been working before. We were all understandably freaked out, and my buddy who's closer goes behind the bed to unplug it and continues to play channel surf static and garbled bits of sentences for a couple seconds, too long, after it was unplugged. We all look at each other, dumbfounded, but after a little bit of talking, the mood's pretty sober and we all decide to turn in for the night. I'm having a hard time sleeping, which isn't out of the ordinary. I have insomnia that was untreated as of then, and my brain just refuses to turn off. Usually, it's some form of worrying about life stuff, but this time it's almost primal fear. I felt very intensely that I was being watched, and felt like whatever was watching me was hunting me in some way. I tried for almost 2 hours to sleep. My spouse is out like a light in the first 20 minutes, and they're a heavy sleeper, so I'm on my own unless I go badger my friends who are asleep in the bed across from us about it. I've had my share of ghosts that don't like me, so my go-to is just putting it out there that I don't mean any harm. and don't want them to leave in peace, which usually works, but never this malicious. I kept thinking, if you're going to do something, do it to me. Leave them out of this. I have too much bravado sometimes, and I'm half asleep, so definitely not the best idea I've had. I eventually drift off very lightly and keep getting this shockingly clear mental image of a woman with a very green pallor and greasy black hair, thick grudge style, standing at the corner of my friend's bed. This is weird for me, especially because I have a very hard time with mental imagery. I think almost exclusively in concepts and conversation, so it's very hard for me and takes a lot of concentration to have a simple mental image, let alone this. I fell completely asleep, eventually, and had nightmares the entire night, so obviously I'm very sleepy upon being woken up for the con. I jokingly paraphrased what I experienced last night, and one of my friends looked at me spooked. He felt the exact same presence, and we basically agree we felt and saw the same thing. A woman with long greasy hair hanging over their bed down to the specific spot she was in. He literally pointed to the spots he felt the spirits before I could. My spouse was just excited to see snakes, but chastised me for being eager to play knight in the shining armor, which, fair. In southern Tennessee, close to Chattanooga, there's a road called Shipley Hollow Road. Going into my story, I didn't know about the legend of Pity Pat or the history of Shipley Hollow. If you haven't heard of Pity Pat or are familiar with the area, Google has some good information on the legend. I was dating someone who lived close by at the time, and we had decided we wanted to go ghost hunting one night. He brought this up because there was a graveyard and it was in the middle of nowhere. As soon as we had discussed going to Shipley Hollow, my dog started acting strange, growling at the doorway when no one was there, pacing and whining. I, of course, already had an uneasy feeling about this place. We got in my car and started the 30-minute drive to the graveyard. The whole drive there, I felt very uncomfortable, like someone was watching us. Almost a sense of dread. We turned on an old road and began our drive up Shipley Hollow Road. About halfway up, the road is a bridge that goes over a stream. I stopped in the car so we could get out and look at the water, and the cousin said he wanted to get in. The bridge was probably 10 to 15 feet from the stream, so it would have been a bit of a hike down. I automatically said no and asked him to get back in the car. He didn't even respond, and my boyfriend had to literally drag him back to the car. It was like he was hypnotized or something. So we get to the graveyard and I park the car. The graveyard, from what I remember, since it was at least 10 years ago, was a gravel road that went through trees to an opening. The road looped around right through the graveyard so that when we got out, there were graves on both sides of us. I turned the car off, flicked off the lights, and the three of us got out of the car. We were talking and looking at the graves using a flashlight when all of a sudden we hear a blood-curdling scream. It was one of those moments where you feel as though you imagined it because of how cliché it would be. Jacob continued to talk and I heard it again. It was faint, like it was far off in the woods. I yelled at him to stop talking and that's when he heard it for the third time. But this time it sounded much closer. The screams were terrifying. It sounded like a woman screaming bloody murder, and the screams lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds. All three of us ran back into the car. I flipped the lights on and sped to get out of there. After that, weird things started happening. I'd wake up feeling like someone was staring at me from a corner in my boyfriend's bedroom. We'd hear voices when we were the only ones at his house. Cabinets and doors would open by themselves. A shampoo bottle flew across the bathroom when I was showering one morning. This was a new house in a new neighborhood as well. It got so bad that his parents hired paranormal investigators to come in and check out their house. We broke up shortly after and they ended up moving houses. I haven't noticed anything since leaving the house, but I was wondering if anyone else has ever visited Shipley Hollow or had something follow them home from somewhere. My husband and I lived in this apartment for a few years. There was one experience in particular that still to this day stands out. Our bedroom was set up so that the door to enter our room was situated in front of the bed. So if you walked in, you'd be looking at our bed. The door was very squeaky and would make noise opening or closing. Now, to the right of our bed was a door for our bathroom. No noise from this door. If you're looking at our bed, I slept on the right side, my husband on the left. One night, I heard him get up and go to the bathroom. I distinctly heard him flip the fan and could hear the hum of the fan. I fall back asleep and shortly after, I hear the main door open, footsteps walk to my side of the bed and heavy breathing. I was so tired I didn't have the energy to open my eyes or acknowledge any of this happening. I just figured it was my husband. The next morning I told him I had a weird dream or heard him in the middle of the night, but I was so tired I couldn't tell the difference. He turned as white as a sheet. I ask him what's wrong, and he tells me that in the middle of the night he also heard heavy breathing. He opened his eyes, he was laying on his side facing me, and said there was a very dark, large shadow standing over me. He couldn't move or yell. I'm very prone to sleep paralysis, and I've had it many times to the point that I know it's happening when I'm in it. My husband, however, has never had this issue, and the fact that we had very similar experiences the same night is also a little scary. Thoughts?